The fluorescent lights of the VA hospital waiting room buzzed overhead as Marcus Thompson sat in the uncomfortable plastic chair, his weathered hands gripping a manila folder containing his medical records. At 52, his face bore the deep lines of a man who had seen too much, his salt and pepper beard neatly trimmed in military precision. The faded anchor and trident tattoo on his forearm caught the harsh light as he shifted nervously, waiting for his appointment with the psychiatrist. Marcus had been struggling for months with nightmares that left him drenched in sweat, flashbacks that struck without warning, and a persistent anxiety that made simple tasks feel overwhelming. The memories of his time in the Navy haunted him, particularly the classified missions he could never discuss with anyone, not even his wife Sarah. The weight of carrying those secrets alone had become unbearable. Marcus Thompson, a nurse called from behind the reception desk. He stood slowly, his back protesting from old injuries sustained during training exercises that had pushed his body to its absolute limits. As he walked toward the office, he noticed other veterans in the waiting room, some missing limbs, others staring blankly at the wall with the hollow look he recognized all too well. Dr. History. Patricia Williams greeted him with a warm smile, her office decorated with certificates and photos of military ceremonies. She was known throughout the VA system as someone who truly understood the unique challenges faced by special operations veterans. As Marcus settled into the leather chair across from her desk, she opened his file and began reviewing his service record. "I see here that you served in the Navy for 12 years. Dr. Pasidik," Williams said, adjusting her glasses. "Can you tell me about your experiences?" "I understand you're having difficulty with some memories from your service." Marcus took a deep breath, his fingers unconsciously tracing the outline of his tattoo. "Doc, I served with some of the finest men I've ever known. We did things that most people couldn't imagine, things that needed to be done to keep this country safe." Over the next hour, Marcus carefully opened up about his struggles, being mindful not to reveal any classified information. He spoke about the brotherhood he had shared with his teammates, the intense training that had forged them into an elite unit, and the psychological toll of carrying out missions that officially never existed. Dr. Williams listened intently, taking notes and asking thoughtful questions. "Marcus, based on what you've told me today, I believe you're dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder. This is actually quite common among special operations personnel. I'd like to start you on a treatment plan that includes therapy and possibly medication. I'm also going to recommend you for some additional benefits." As Dr. Williams began filling out paperwork, she paused at a section asking for specific unit information. "I need to verify your service record for these benefits. It says here you were assigned to various Naval Special Warfare units. Can you be more specific about which teams you served with?" Marcus felt his chest tighten. The truth was complicated. While he had indeed served with distinction in naval special warfare, the exact nature of his assignments remained classified even decades later. The unit he had served with operated under such deep cover that their very existence was known only to a handful of high-ranking officials. "Ma'am, I served with SEAL teams in various capacities. Some of that information is still classified, but I can tell you that everything in my service record is accurate." Dr. Williams nodded and continued with the paperwork. Unknown to Marcus, this conversation was being recorded as part of standard VA procedures. The recording would later be reviewed by administrative personnel who were tasked with verifying veteran claims and ensuring the integrity of the benefits system. 3 days later, Marcus was at his job at the local hardware store, helping a customer select the right screws for a deck repair project. His manager, Jim Rodriguez, had been accommodating about his VA appointments, understanding the challenges that many veterans faced when transitioning back to civilian life. Marcus enjoyed the work. The problem-solving reminded him of the technical challenges he had faced in the military, and helping people fix things gave him a sense of purpose. The bell above the door chimed as 2 men in dark suits entered the store. They surveyed the space before approaching the counter where Marcus was ringing up a customer's purchase. Something about their bearing immediately caught his attention. They moved with the calculated precision of law enforcement. "Are you Marcus Thompson?" the taller of the 2 men asked, displaying a badge from the Department of Veterans Affairs Office of Inspector General. "Yes, sir, that's me," Marcus replied, his military training automatically making him stand straighter. "Mr. Thompson, I'm Agent Bradley, and this is Agent Chen. We need to speak with you regarding some statements you made during a recent VA appointment. Marcus felt his heart rate increase, but he maintained his composure. Of course. What can I help you with? Agent Bradley consulted a small notebook. You claimed during your psychiatric evaluation that you served with Navy SEAL teams. However, our initial investigation of your service record shows no evidence of SEAL training or assignment to any SEAL teams. The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. He had spent decades following the strict protocols of operational security, never revealing the true nature of his service, even when it would have been beneficial to do so. Now, that very discretion was being used against him. Gentlemen, I can assure you that my service record is accurate. There may be aspects of my assignments that aren't immediately apparent in standard personnel files. Agent Chen stepped forward, his expression skeptical. Mr. Calls. Thompson, impersonating a member of the armed forces for the purpose of obtaining benefits is a federal crime. We've seen a significant increase in these cases, and we take them very seriously. Marcus felt the walls of the hardware store seeming to close in around him. Other customers had begun to notice the commotion, and he could see Jim watching with concern from the back office. The life he had built, the quiet existence he had carved out for himself after years of service in the shadows, was suddenly under threat. I understand your concerns, Marcus said carefully, but I think there's been a misunderstanding. If you'll give me some time, I can provide additional documentation. Agent Bradley shook his head. I'm afraid we need to resolve this immediately. Mr. Thompson, you're under arrest for fraudulent representation to obtain veteran benefits. As the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, Marcus felt a familiar calm descend over him. The same psychological state he had entered during dangerous missions, when everything depended on keeping a clear head. The customers in the store stared in shock, and he could hear Jim on the phone, probably calling Sarah to let her know what had happened. The ride to the federal building was conducted in silence. Marcus stared out the window at the familiar streets of his hometown, wondering how everything had gone so wrong so quickly. He thought about Sarah, about how she would react when she learned of his arrest. She knew he had served in the military, but, like everyone else in his civilian life, she had no idea about the true nature of his service. The processing at the federal building was efficient and impersonal. Fingerprints, photographs, paperwork, the same bureaucratic machinery that existed in every law enforcement agency he had ever encountered. Marcus answered the basic questions, but remained silent about the specifics of his service, knowing that revealing classified information would only make his situation worse. Agent Bradley sat across from him in the small interview room, a thick file spread out on the metal table between them. Mr. Thompson, I'm going to give you one more chance to tell the truth. Our investigation shows that you completed basic training and served as a regular Navy enlisted man. There is no record of you attending basic underwater demolition/SEAL training at Naval Amphibious Base Coronado. There's no record of you being assigned to SEAL Team 1, 2, 3, or any other SEAL unit. Marcus looked at the agent with the steady gaze he had once used to assess threats in hostile territory. Agent Bradley, I appreciate the thoroughness of your investigation, but I respectfully maintain that my service record is accurate. There are aspects of military service that may not be reflected in standard personnel databases. Thompson, we've heard every excuse in the book. Veterans who claim they were Green Berets when they were cooks, Marines who say they were Force Recon when they worked in supply, and Navy sailors who claim they were SEALs when they never made it past the first week of boot camp. The stolen valor problem has reached epidemic proportions. The term stolen valor struck Marcus particularly hard. Throughout his military career, he had witnessed genuine acts of heroism and sacrifice. He had served alongside men who had died in service to their country, their true stories never to be told due to the classified nature of their missions. The suggestion that he was dishonoring their memory by lying about his own service was almost unbearable. I understand your frustration with fraudulent claims, Marcus said quietly. But I assure you that I would never dishonor the memory of the men I served with by making false statements about my service. The interview continued for several more hours, with agents presenting evidence they claimed proved Marcus was lying. They showed him personnel records, training rosters, and deployment schedules, none of which contained his name in connection with SEAL units. Each piece of evidence felt like another nail in the coffin of his freedom. Finally, Agent Chen leaned back in his chair and delivered what seemed to be their final assessment. Thompson, the evidence is overwhelming. You have fraudulently claimed to be a Navy SEAL in order to obtain veterans' benefits. You will be charged under federal law, and if convicted, you could face significant prison time and substantial fines. As Marcus was led to a holding cell to await his arraignment, he thought about the irony of his situation. He had spent years protecting national security secrets, following orders that sometimes required him to deny his own involvement in successful missions. Now, that same discretion was being interpreted as evidence of deception. The holding cell was small and sparse, with a single bench and a toilet. Marcus sat quietly, his mind racing through the events that had led him to this moment. He thought about his teammates, wondering if any of them had faced similar situations. Most of them had probably transitioned to other careers within the special operations community, where their true service records would be recognized and valued. As evening approached, Marcus was allowed a phone call. He dialed Sarah's number with trembling fingers, dreading the conversation he was about to have. "Marcus? Where are you?" Jim called and said something about police, but I couldn't understand what he was talking about. "Sarah, I need you to listen carefully. I've been arrested on charges related to my military service. There's been a misunderstanding about my records, and I need you to contact a lawyer." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for what felt like hours. "Arrested? Marcus, what are you talking about? What kind of misunderstanding?" "The VA investigators believe I lied about my service record. I can't explain everything right now, but I need you to know that I've never lied to you or anyone else about my time in the military." When the call ended, Marcus was returned to his cell to spend the night before his arraignment. As he lay on the narrow bench staring at the ceiling, he wondered if there was anyone left who could verify his true service record. Most of the officers who had commanded his unit were either dead or had disappeared into the same shadows that had once concealed his own activities. The next morning brought his arraignment before a federal magistrate. Marcus stood in his orange jumpsuit as the charges were read. Fraudulent representation to obtain veteran benefits, a federal felony that carried serious penalties. His court-appointed attorney, a young woman named Rebecca Martinez, had reviewed his case file, but seemed as confused as everyone else about the discrepancies in his service record. "Your Honor," Attorney Martinez addressed the court, "my client maintains his innocence and asserts that his service record is accurate. We request time to conduct our own investigation into these allegations." The magistrate, a stern-looking man with gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses, reviewed the paperwork before him. "Thompson, you are charged with serious federal crimes. The government has presented evidence that your claims of SEAL service are fraudulent. How do you plead?" Marcus stood straighter, his voice clear and steady. "Not guilty, Your Honor." Bail was set at $50,000, an amount that would require Marcus to use the equity in his home as collateral. As he was led back to his cell to await bail processing, he caught a glimpse of Sarah in the courtroom gallery. Her face showed a mixture of confusion, worry, and something else he couldn't quite identify, perhaps the first seeds of doubt about the man she had married. The local newspaper picked up the story that evening. "Local veteran charged with impersonating Navy SEAL." The article included Marcus's photograph and details about his arrest, effectively destroying his reputation in the small community where he had quietly lived for years. By the time he was released on bail the following day, the story had spread throughout the town. Walking back into his house felt surreal. Everything looked the same, but Marcus knew that nothing would ever be the same again. Sarah greeted him with a hug, but he could feel the tension in her body, the unspoken questions that hung in the air between them. That evening, as they sat in their living room, Sarah finally asked the question Marcus had been dreading. "Marcus, I need to know the truth. Did you really serve with the SEALs, or have you been lying to me for all these years?" Marcus looked at his wife, the woman he had shared his life with for 15 years, and felt the crushing weight of secrets he could never reveal. "Sarah, I swear to you that I have never lied about my military service. There are things about what I did in the Navy that I cannot discuss, but everything I've told you is true." "But the investigators seem so certain. They have all these records, all this evidence. How can they all be wrong?" It was a fair question, and Marcus didn't have an answer that would satisfy her without revealing information he was still legally bound to keep secret. The classified nature of his true service had become a prison from which there seemed to be no escape. As the days passed, Marcus found himself increasingly isolated. Friends from work avoided him, neighbors whispered when he walked by, and even the cashier at the grocery store looked at him with suspicion. The presumption of innocence seemed to mean nothing in the court of public opinion. Attorney Martinez worked diligently to prepare his defense, but she was hampered by the same lack of documentation that had triggered the investigation in the first place. Standard military personnel databases showed no record of Marcus attending SEAL training or serving with SEAL teams. Without access to classified records, she was fighting an uphill battle with one hand tied behind her back. 3 weeks after his arrest, Marcus received an unexpected phone call. The number was unlisted, and the voice on the other end was one he hadn't heard in nearly 20 years. Marcus? This is Commander Harrison. I heard about your situation through some old contacts. We need to talk. Commander David Harrison had been Marcus's commanding officer during some of the most sensitive operations of his military career. If anyone could help verify his service record, it would be Harrison. They arranged to meet at a coffee shop on the outskirts of town, away from prying eyes and curious neighbors. Harrison looked older, but still carried himself with the bearing of a career military officer. As they sat in a corner booth, he spoke in the low, careful tones that Marcus remembered from classified briefings. Marcus, I want you to know that what's happening to you is a travesty. Your service record is exemplary, and the work you did was absolutely critical to national security. The problem is that the operations you were involved with are still classified at the highest levels. Even I can't officially acknowledge your participation without clearance from the Pentagon. Sir, is there anything you can do? Any way to verify my service without compromising operational security? Harrison was quiet for a long moment, stirring his coffee thoughtfully. There might be one option. There's an admiral at the Pentagon who was involved in overseeing some of your operations. If anyone has the authority to declassify enough information to clear your name, it would be him. But Marcus, you need to understand that reaching out to him could have consequences for both of us. Marcus felt a glimmer of hope for the first time since his arrest. Commander, my life has already been destroyed. My wife is starting to doubt me. My community thinks I'm a fraud, and I'm facing serious prison time. I'm willing to take that risk. Harrison nodded slowly. I'll make some calls. But Marcus, this is going to take time, and there are no guarantees. The military bureaucracy moves slowly, especially when it comes to classified materials. As Marcus drove home from the meeting, he felt a complex mixture of hope and anxiety. There was finally a potential path to vindication, but it would require navigating the same complex web of secrecy that had created his current predicament. He thought about the tattoo on his arm, the permanent reminder of his service that no one seemed willing to recognize as authentic. That night, as he lay in bed listening to Sarah's troubled breathing beside him, Marcus reflected on the cruel irony of his situation. He had spent years in the service of his country, risking his life in operations that would never be publicly acknowledged. Now, that same secrecy threatened to destroy everything he had built in the aftermath of his military career. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for the following month, and Marcus knew that without some form of official verification of his service record, his chances of avoiding conviction were slim. The evidence against him seemed overwhelming to anyone without access to classified information. His only hope lay in the possibility that someone with sufficient authority would be willing to step forward and reveal enough truth to save him from a fate he didn't deserve. As he finally drifted off to sleep, Marcus dreamed of his old teammates, wondering where they were now and whether they would face the same accusations if their own service records were ever questioned. In his dreams, they were young again, preparing for another mission, their bond forged in the crucible of shared danger and sacrifice. When he woke the next morning, reality crashed back down on him like a cold wave, and he faced another day of waiting for news that might never come. The preliminary hearing arrived on a gray October morning, with autumn leaves swirling across the courthouse steps as Marcus walked beside his attorney. The media attention had grown considerably since his arrest, with reporters from military publications and veteran advocacy groups taking interest in the case. Rebecca Martinez had warned him that the hearing would be largely procedural, but Marcus still felt the weight of each step as they climbed toward the courthouse entrance. Inside the courtroom, Marcus noticed several unfamiliar faces in the gallery. Some appeared to be journalists, others looked like they might be veterans themselves, drawn by curiosity or solidarity. Agent Bradley sat at the prosecution table, surrounded by boxes of evidence that seemed to grow larger each time Marcus saw them. Federal Prosecutor Janet Chen, no relation to the investigating agent, stood to present the government's case. She was known for her meticulous preparation and her track record of successful prosecutions in fraud cases. As she began her opening statement, Marcus felt the familiar sensation of being assessed by a professional adversary. Your Honor, the evidence in this case is straightforward and overwhelming. Mr. Thompson has fraudulently claimed to be a Navy SEAL in order to obtain veteran benefits to which he is not entitled. Our investigation has revealed no evidence whatsoever that he attended basic underwater demolition/SEAL training, no evidence that he was assigned to any SEAL team, and no evidence that he participated in any SEAL operations. Prosecutor Chen presented a timeline of Marcus's military service, based on the records that were available in standard databases. According to their research, Marcus had enlisted in the Navy at age 18, completed basic training at Great Lakes Naval Training Center, and was then assigned to various support roles throughout his 12-year career. Nothing in these records indicated any connection to naval special warfare. The defendant's own statements to VA personnel reveal an elaborate fantasy about elite military service that simply never occurred. Thompson has constructed a false narrative about classified missions and elite training that exists only in his imagination. Attorney Martinez rose for her response, and Marcus could see the challenge she faced. Without access to classified records, she was forced to argue based on character and circumstantial evidence rather than hard facts. Your Honor, Mr. Thompson has lived his life as a model citizen and veteran. He has never sought publicity or recognition for his military service. In fact, he has been notably private about his experiences, which is hardly the behavior one would expect from someone fabricating heroic service. We believe there are aspects of Mr. Thompson's military record that are not reflected in standard personnel databases. The hearing proceeded with testimony from Agent Bradley, who detailed the investigation that had led to Marcus's arrest. He explained how routine verification procedures had failed to find any evidence of SEAL service, and how subsequent interviews with Marcus had only deepened their suspicions. Thompson was unable to provide any specific details about SEAL training that couldn't be found in publicly available books or movies. When asked about specific instructors, training schedules, or operational details, he claimed that such information was classified. Marcus listened to this characterization of his behavior with growing frustration. The truth was that he had been extremely careful not to reveal any genuine classified information, even when doing so might have helped his case. His adherence to security protocols was being interpreted as evidence of deception. Patricia Williams was called to testify about her interactions with Marcus at the VA. She appeared uncomfortable as she described how Marcus had claimed SEAL service during their psychiatric evaluation. Mr. Thompson was seeking treatment for what he described as combat-related PTSD. He spoke about traumatic experiences during military service, but when I attempted to verify the details for his benefits application, discrepancies began to emerge. During cross-examination, Attorney Martinez established that Dr. Williams had found Marcus's presentation of PTSD symptoms to be genuine and consistent with combat trauma. This raised important questions about how someone could develop authentic combat-related stress disorders without having seen combat. Dr. Williams, in your professional opinion, were Mr. Thompson's psychological symptoms consistent with someone who had experienced combat trauma? His presentation was very consistent with what we see in special operations veterans. The hypervigilance, the sleep disturbances, the difficulty discussing specific experiences, these are all common in that population. After the hearing, Marcus met with Commander Harrison at a small diner outside of town. Harrison looked troubled as he slid into the booth across from Marcus. "I've been making inquiries through old channels," Harrison said quietly, "and I'm running into roadblocks everywhere. The operations we were involved with are still classified under programs that most people don't even know exist. Even confirming that such programs existed would require clearances that very few people have." Marcus stirred his coffee absently, watching the steam rise from the cup. "What about the Admiral you mentioned? Any word from him? That's actually why I wanted to meet." "Admiral Morrison is willing to look into your situation, but he's being very careful about how he proceeds. He can't officially acknowledge classified programs without proper authorization, but he might be able to find a way to verify your service through back channels. Harrison explained that Admiral Morrison had been a captain during the time period when Marcus served under classified programs. He had since risen to a senior position at the Pentagon, where he had access to historical records that might provide the verification Marcus needed. The challenge, Harrison continued, is that even if the Admiral can confirm your service, he may not be able to do so in a way that would be admissible in court. The government's classification system is designed to protect secrets, not to provide convenient documentation for legal proceedings. Over the following weeks, Marcus's case began to attract attention from veteran advocacy groups and military bloggers who specialized in special operations history. Some of these advocates had experience with the bureaucratic challenges faced by veterans whose service records were incomplete or classified. Tom Bradley, a retired Army Special Forces operator who now worked as a veterans' rights advocate, reached out to Marcus through attorney Martinez. Bradley had seen similar cases where legitimate special operations veterans had been accused of stolen valor due to incomplete records. The problem, Bradley explained during a phone conversation, is that the government has created multiple layers of classification that make it nearly impossible to verify certain types of service. Units that operated under special access programs often have records that are compartmentalized beyond normal classification levels. Bradley offered to help research Marcus's case using his connections within the special operations community. He had access to informal networks of retired operators who might remember Marcus or the operations he had been involved with. Meanwhile, the prosecution's investigation continued to expand. Agent Chen had contacted former Navy personnel who had served at the same bases as Marcus during his career, seeking anyone who might remember him claiming to be a SEAL. This fishing expedition yielded mixed results, with some former sailors recalling Marcus as a quiet, professional person who rarely discussed his duties. However, one former petty officer came forward with a statement that seemed to support the prosecution's case. Robert Martinez claimed that Marcus had told him during their service that he was assigned to a SEAL support unit, which Martinez interpreted as a false claim of SEAL status. This testimony became a crucial part of the prosecution's case, despite the fact that Marcus had never claimed to be a SEAL to this particular individual. The distinction between supporting SEAL operations and being a SEAL team member was lost in the legal proceedings, where nuance was often sacrificed for simplicity. Attorney Martinez worked to counter this narrative by finding character witnesses who could testify to Marcus's honesty and integrity. Jim Rodriguez, his manager at the hardware store, agreed to testify about Marcus's work ethic and humble demeanor. Marcus never talked about being some kind of war hero, Rodriguez explained. If anything, he seemed to want to avoid talking about his military service. That's not the behavior of someone who's trying to impress people with fake stories. Sarah also agreed to testify on her husband's behalf, despite her own growing doubts about the situation. The strain on their marriage had become increasingly apparent as the legal proceedings dragged on. She found herself caught between her love for Marcus and her confusion about the accusations against him. "I've been married to Marcus for 15 years, she would later testify, and he has never once tried to impress anyone with stories about his military service. If anything, I've always wished he would talk more about his experiences, because I could see that keeping everything inside was hurting him." As winter approached, Admiral Morrison finally made contact through Commander Harrison. The message was cryptic, but offered a glimmer of hope. Morrison was willing to review Marcus's case personally, but he would need to see Marcus face-to-face to make a proper assessment. The meeting was arranged for a Saturday morning at the Naval Memorial in Washington, D.C. Marcus drove the 4 hours from his hometown, accompanied by Commander Harrison, who would serve as an intermediary. The memorial's setting seemed appropriate for what might be Marcus's last chance to prove his innocence. Admiral Morrison was a distinguished-looking man in his early 60s, with silver hair and the kind of bearing that commanded immediate respect. He wore civilian clothes, but his posture and mannerisms clearly identified him as a senior military officer. As they sat on a bench overlooking the memorial's fountains, Morrison studied Marcus with the penetrating gaze of someone accustomed to making life-and-death decisions based on quick assessments. "Mr. Thompson," Morrison began, "I've reviewed what documentation I can access regarding your service record. The challenge we face is that the programs you are involved with remain highly classified, and I cannot officially acknowledge their existence without proper authorization. Marcus felt his heart sink, but Morrison continued. However, I may be able to provide some unofficial guidance that could help your legal team understand the nature of your service. Tell me about your tattoo.
The question caught Marcus off guard.
He looked down at his forearm where the faded anchor and trident were visible beneath his sleeve. Sir, I got this tattoo after completing my first deployment with the team. It was a tradition among the guys I served with. Morrison nodded slowly. Can you describe the specific design elements of that tattoo and where you had it done? Marcus rolled up his sleeve, revealing the full tattoo. It was more elaborate than it appeared at first glance, with specific details that spoke to insider knowledge of naval special warfare traditions. The design included elements that were not widely known outside the special operations community. This was done at a shop in Virginia Beach, just outside Little Creek. The artist was an ex-SEAL himself, and he only did this particular design for guys who had earned the right to wear it. There are specific elements here that represent, well, things that I still can't discuss in detail. Admiral Morrison examined the tattoo closely, and Marcus saw something change in his expression. Recognition? Respect. It was difficult to tell, but the Admiral's demeanor shifted noticeably. Mr. Thompson, I'm going to need some time to make some very discreet inquiries. I cannot make any promises, but I may be able to find a way to provide some form of verification that would be helpful in your case. The drive home was conducted largely in silence, with Commander Harrison respecting Marcus's need to process what had just occurred. The meeting had felt significant, but Marcus was afraid to hope for too much. He had been disappointed too many times already. Back home, the waiting continued. Marcus's case had become something of a cause célèbre in certain military circles, with debates raging on social media about the challenges faced by veterans whose service records were classified or incomplete. Some commentators supported Marcus, arguing that the government had created an impossible situation for legitimate special operations veterans. Others maintained that stolen valor was a serious problem that required aggressive prosecution. The legal maneuvering continued as both sides prepared for trial. Prosecutor Chen filed motions to exclude testimony about classified programs, arguing that such claims were irrelevant to the specific charges against Marcus. Attorney Martinez countered with motions requesting access to classified records that might exonerate her client. Judge Patricia Hawkins, who had been assigned to preside over the trial, found herself in the unusual position of mediating disputes about classified information in a civilian court. She ordered both sides to participate in a closed hearing where classification issues could be discussed without compromising national security. During this closed hearing, attended only by the judge, attorneys, and security-cleared personnel, some of the complexity of Marcus's situation began to emerge. While specific details remained classified, it became clear that there were legitimate questions about the completeness of his publicly available service record. However, these revelations did not immediately translate into support for Marcus's case. The burden of proof remained on the defense to demonstrate that Marcus's claims were legitimate, and classified information could not be used as evidence without proper declassification procedures. As December arrived, Marcus received unexpected news. Admiral Morrison had requested a meeting with Judge Hawkins to discuss matters related to the case. This meeting would be conducted ex parte, meaning that neither the prosecution nor the defense would be present, and its contents would remain classified. Attorney Martinez explained that this was highly unusual, but represented their best hope for some form of official recognition of Marcus's service. If Admiral Morrison can convince the judge that there are legitimate classification issues affecting your case, it might change how this whole proceeding moves forward. The meeting between Admiral Morrison and Judge Hawkins lasted 2 hours and remained shrouded in secrecy. Neither the prosecution nor the defense was informed about what was discussed, but Judge Hawkins appeared thoughtful and troubled when she returned to open court the following day. Counsel for both sides, Judge Hawkins announced, I have received information that requires me to reconsider certain aspects of this case. I am ordering a 30-day recess to allow for additional investigation into matters that have come to my attention. This development sent shockwaves through both legal teams. Prosecutor Chen demanded to know what new information had emerged, while Attorney Martinez wondered if this might finally be the break they had been hoping for. During the recess, Marcus tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy, but the strain was showing on everyone in his family. Sarah had been forced to take a leave of absence from her job as a schoolteacher due to the publicity surrounding the case. Their teenage daughter Ashley was being teased at school by classmates who had read about her father's arrest. The community's reaction had been mixed but generally hostile. While some neighbors and friends supported Marcus, many others seemed to take the charges at face value. The local VFW post, where Marcus had been a member for years, quietly asked him to suspend his membership pending the resolution of his case. Tom Bradley, the veteran's advocate who had been helping with Marcus's case, reported some encouraging developments from his own investigation. He had located several retired special operations personnel who remembered Marcus from their time in the service, though most were reluctant to come forward publicly due to security concerns. The problem is that the guys who could most clearly vouch for you are also the ones who are most concerned about revealing classified information, Bradley explained. It's a catch-22 that the government has created, probably unintentionally. Bradley had also discovered some circumstantial evidence that supported Marcus's claims. Military medical records showed that Marcus had received treatment for injuries consistent with high-intensity training and operations. His promotion history and commendation records, while not specifically mentioning SEAL service, showed a pattern typical of special operations personnel. As the 30-day recess neared its end, Marcus received a phone call that would change everything. The voice on the other end was crisp and authoritative, clearly accustomed to giving orders and having them followed without question. Thompson, this is Admiral Morrison. I need you to meet me at the Pentagon tomorrow at 1400. Bring your attorney and be prepared to provide a detailed debriefing about your service record. Marcus felt a surge of hope mixed with anxiety. This summons suggested that Admiral Morrison had found something significant, but he had learned not to count on anything until it actually happened. Too much had gone wrong already for him to feel confident about any positive developments. The drive to Washington felt surreal, with Marcus dressed in his best civilian suit and trying to prepare mentally for what might be his last chance to prove his innocence. Attorney Martinez sat beside him in the passenger seat, reviewing notes and preparing for what promised to be the most unusual meeting of her legal career. As they approached the Pentagon's imposing facade, Marcus thought about all the times he had entered this building during his military service. Then, he had been part of the system, trusted with the nation's most sensitive secrets. Now, he was an outsider, fighting to prove that his service had been real and meaningful. The security procedures at the Pentagon were as rigorous as Marcus remembered, with multiple checkpoints and thorough background verification. The guards who processed their entry were professional but clearly aware of the unusual nature of their visit. Marcus and his attorney were escorted through corridors he recognized from his previous life, past offices where decisions were made that would never be publicly acknowledged. Admiral Morrison met them in a small conference room deep within the Pentagon's maze of offices. The room was sterile and secure, the kind of place where sensitive conversations could be held without fear of surveillance or eavesdropping. Morrison was accompanied by a Navy captain whom he introduced simply as Captain Williams, without elaborating on her role in the proceedings. Thompson, Morrison began without preamble. I have spent the last month conducting a very careful review of your service record. This review has required accessing databases and archives that are not normally available for such purposes. Marcus felt his heart racing as Morrison continued. I want to be very clear about something. What I am about to tell you cannot be used directly in your legal proceedings without proper declassification procedures. However, I believe it is important for you and your attorney to understand the true nature of your situation. Morrison opened a thick folder and began to review documents that Marcus could not see clearly from his position across the table. Your service record, as it appears in standard databases, is incomplete by design. You were assigned to units and programs that were deliberately omitted from normal personnel tracking systems for operational security reasons. The words Marcus had been hoping to hear for months finally came, but they were tempered by Morrison's warnings about classification restrictions. You did indeed serve with Naval Special Warfare units during multiple deployments. Your training and operational assignments were legitimate and were conducted under programs that remain classified to this day. Attorney Martinez leaned forward, trying to understand the implications of what Morrison was saying. Admiral, does this mean that Mr. Thompson's claims about his service are accurate? Miss Martinez, It means that your client's service record reflects assignments and training that were deliberately concealed for national security reasons. The challenge we face is that acknowledging this service officially would require revealing information that could compromise ongoing operations and personnel. Marcus felt a complex mixture of vindication and frustration. His service was being acknowledged, but in a way that might not save him from conviction and imprisonment. Morrison seemed to understand his dilemma. Thompson, I cannot directly intervene in your legal proceedings, but I may be able to provide some assistance that could help resolve your situation. However, this assistance will require your cooperation and your continued commitment to protecting classified information. The meeting continued for another hour, with Morrison outlining potential approaches to resolving Marcus's case without compromising national security. The solutions were complex and would require coordination between multiple government agencies, but they offered hope where none had existed before. As they prepared to leave the Pentagon, Morrison made one final comment that stayed with Marcus during the long drive home. Mr. Thompson, your country owes you a debt of gratitude for your service and for your continued discretion in protecting sensitive information. I want you to know that your sacrifices have not gone unnoticed, even if they cannot always be publicly acknowledged. The drive home was filled with cautious optimism. For the first time since his arrest, Marcus felt that someone in authority understood his situation and was working to help him. The path forward remained uncertain, but it no longer seemed hopeless. However, the real test would come when court reconvened the following week. Despite Admiral Morrison's private acknowledgement of his service, Marcus still faced federal charges that could result in years in prison. The gap between classified truth and public evidence remained as wide as ever, and Marcus knew that his legal battle was far from over. The federal courthouse buzzed with unusual activity on the morning Marcus's trial was scheduled to begin. News vans lined the street outside. Their satellite dishes pointed skyward like technological flowers seeking sunlight. The case had attracted national attention, becoming a symbol of larger issues surrounding veterans' rights, classification systems, and the stolen valor problem that had plagued military communities for years. Marcus walked up the courthouse steps beside Attorney Martinez, ignoring the shouted questions from reporters and the flash of cameras. He wore his best navy blue suit, the same one he had worn to his daughter Ashley's high school graduation just 6 months earlier. The symbolism wasn't lost on him. This trial would determine whether he would be present for future milestones in his family's life or would be watching them from behind prison bars. Inside the courthouse, the gallery was packed with an unusual mix of spectators. Veterans wearing various unit insignia sat alongside military bloggers, legal observers, and curious members of the public. Marcus noticed several faces he recognized from his research into his case: advocates who had written about classification issues, former special operations personnel who had followed the proceedings with interest, and journalists who specialized in military affairs. Sarah sat in the front row directly behind the defense table, her face a mask of controlled anxiety. She had aged visibly over the past months, her auburn hair now showing streaks of gray that hadn't been there before Marcus's arrest. Ashley sat beside her mother, having been allowed to miss school to attend the opening day of her father's trial. Judge Patricia Hawkins entered the courtroom with her usual brisk efficiency, her black robes flowing behind her as she took her place at the bench. She was known throughout the federal district as a fair but no-nonsense jurist who ran her courtroom with military precision, an irony that wasn't lost on Marcus as he prepared to fight for his freedom. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Judge Hawkins began after the preliminary proceedings were completed, "you are about to hear a case that involves complex questions about military service records, veteran benefits, and the nature of classified information. Your job is to determine whether the defendant knowingly made false statements about his military service for the purpose of obtaining benefits." Prosecutor Janet Chen rose for her opening statement, projecting confidence as she approached the jury box. She was impeccably dressed in a charcoal gray suit, her dark hair pulled back in a professional bun that emphasized her serious demeanor. As she began to speak, her voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to winning cases. "Ladies and gentlemen, this case is about lies, deception, and the theft of honor that belongs to genuine heroes. The defendant, Marcus Thompson, has fraudulently claimed to be a Navy SEAL for the purpose of obtaining veterans' benefits to which he has no right. Chen outlined the prosecution's case with methodical precision, explaining how their investigation had failed to find any evidence of SEAL training or service in Marcus's official records. She described his statements to VA personnel as elaborate fabrications designed to support fraudulent benefit claims. The evidence will show that Mr. Thompson never attended basic underwater demolition/SEAL training at Naval Amphibious Base Coronado. He was never assigned to SEAL Team 1, 2, 3, or any other SEAL unit. He never participated in the rigorous selection process that transforms ordinary sailors into elite special operations warriors. The prosecutor's presentation was compelling and well-organized, supported by charts and documents that seemed to definitively prove her points. Marcus watched the jurors' faces as Chen spoke, seeing skepticism and disapproval forming in their expressions. Without access to classified information, the prosecution's narrative appeared airtight. You will hear testimony from VA investigators who discovered these discrepancies, from military personnel experts who will explain how SEAL training and assignments are documented, and from the defendant's own words as he attempted to maintain his fraudulent claims even when confronted with evidence of their falsity. Chen concluded her opening by appealing to the jury's sense of justice and respect for genuine military service. Ladies and gentlemen, real Navy SEALs have earned their reputation through sacrifice, dedication, and courage that most of us can only imagine. They deserve better than to have their honor stolen by someone seeking undeserved benefits and recognition. Attorney Martinez rose for the defense opening, and Marcus could see the challenge she faced in the jurors' already skeptical expressions. She had spent weeks preparing for this moment, knowing that she would need to plant seeds of doubt without being able to present the evidence that would most effectively exonerate her client. Members of the jury, Martinez began, you have just heard a very convincing presentation from the prosecution. Their case appears strong because they have access to certain types of military records, while other types of records remain unavailable due to classification restrictions. Martinez explained that military service, particularly in special operations units, often involved assignments and training that were not reflected in standard personnel databases. She described how the nature of certain military operations required operational security measures that could make verification difficult decades later. Mr. Peabody Parafoles. Thompson has lived his life as a quiet, humble veteran who never sought recognition or publicity for his military service. He worked at a hardware store, raised his family, and tried to build a peaceful life after his service to our country. This is not the behavior of someone seeking stolen glory. The defense attorney's strategy was to emphasize the character evidence and circumstantial factors that supported Marcus's credibility while acknowledging the limitations they faced in directly proving his service. She promised to present witnesses who would testify to Marcus's integrity and to evidence that his claims were consistent with authentic special operations service. The prosecution wants you to believe that this case is simple, that their records tell the whole story. But military service, particularly the kind of service that must remain classified for national security reasons, is never simple. We ask you to consider all the evidence, including what the prosecution cannot or will not show you. The first prosecution witness was Agent Bradley, the VA investigator who had initiated the case against Marcus. He testified about the routine verification procedures that had failed to find evidence of SEAL service and about his subsequent interview with Marcus that had led to the fraud charges. The defendant claimed to have served with SEAL teams during multiple deployments, Bradley testified. But when we asked for specific details that could be verified, he repeatedly claimed that such information was classified. Under cross-examination, Martinez attempted to establish that legitimate special operations veterans might indeed be unable to provide verifiable details about classified operations. Bradley acknowledged that classification restrictions did exist, but maintained that basic training and assignment information would be available in standard databases. Agent Bradley, Martinez asked, are you familiar with special access programs or other highly classified military programs that might not be reflected in standard personnel records? I'm aware that such programs exist, Bradley replied carefully. But in my experience, all military personnel have basic assignment and training records that can be verified through normal channels. Patricia Williams, the VA psychiatrist who had first raised questions about Marcus's service record, Her testimony was particularly damaging because it came from someone who was sympathetic to veterans and had initially believed Marcus's claims. Mr. Thompson presented with symptoms consistent with combat-related PTSD, Dr. Williams testified. However, when I attempted to verify his service record for benefits purposes, I discovered discrepancies that raised concerns about the truthfulness of his claims. During cross-examination, Williams had found Marcus's psychological presentation to be authentic and consistent with combat trauma. This created an important contradiction in the prosecution's case. How could someone develop genuine combat-related stress disorders without having experienced combat? Dr. Williams, in your professional opinion, would it be possible for someone to fake the type of PTSD symptoms that Mr. Thompson displayed? It would be very difficult, Dr. Williams admitted. The symptoms he presented were quite consistent with what we see in genuine cases of combat-related PTSD, particularly in special operations veterans. The prosecution also called Robert Martinez, the former Navy petty officer who claimed that Marcus had made false statements about his service during their time in the military. Martinez testified that Marcus had told him he was assigned to a SEAL support unit, which Martinez interpreted as a claim of SEAL status. This testimony was problematic for the defense because it suggested a pattern of false claims dating back to Marcus's time in service. However, Martinez's recollection was hazy on details, and he admitted under cross-examination that he had not seen Marcus in over 15 years before being contacted by investigators. Mr. Martinez, Attorney Martinez asked during cross-examination, "Is it possible that Mr. Chesky reassociated? Thompson was indeed assigned to support SEAL operations without being a SEAL team member himself?" "I guess that's possible," Martinez replied, "but he definitely gave me the impression that he was something more than a regular sailor." The prosecution's case continued with testimony from military personnel experts who explained how SEAL training and assignments were documented. These witnesses effectively demonstrated that there was no evidence of Marcus attending BUD/S training or being assigned to SEAL teams in any capacity. Commander James Patterson, a retired SEAL who now worked as a consultant, testified about the rigorous documentation requirements for special operations personnel. His testimony was particularly compelling because it came from someone with unquestioned credibility within the SEAL community. Every person who completes BUD/S training is documented in multiple databases, Commander Patterson testified. Assignment to SEAL teams is similarly documented. There are simply no gaps in these records that would explain the absence of documentation for Mr. Thompson's claimed service. During cross-examination, Martinez attempted to establish that certain types of special operations assignments might not be reflected in standard databases. Commander Patterson acknowledged that some operations remained classified, but maintained that basic personnel assignments would still be documented. As the prosecution's case continued, Marcus felt increasingly discouraged. Despite Admiral Morrison's private acknowledgement of his service, the public evidence against him appeared overwhelming. The jury seemed convinced by the prosecution's systematic presentation of his lack of documentation. The prosecution concluded their case with Agent Chen's presentation of Marcus's statements to VA personnel and investigators. She played recordings of his interviews, highlighting moments where he claimed classified restrictions prevented him from providing details about his service. "Ladies and gentlemen," Prosecutor Chen said in her closing argument for this phase, "you have heard clear and convincing evidence that the defendant has no legitimate claim to SEAL service. His own words reveal the elaborate fantasy he has constructed to support his fraudulent benefit claims." As the prosecution rested their case, Marcus felt the weight of potential conviction pressing down on him. The evidence against him had been presented systematically and convincingly, and he knew that the defense would face an uphill battle in creating reasonable doubt. That evening, Marcus met with his legal team to prepare for the defense phase of the trial. The conference room at Martinez's law firm was cluttered with documents, legal briefs, and evidence files that represented months of preparation for this moment. "I'll be honest with you, Marcus," Martinez said as they reviewed their strategy. "The prosecution has presented a strong case, and we're limited in what we can present to counter it. Our best hope is to establish your credibility through character witnesses, and to highlight the inconsistencies in their case." Tom Bradley, the veteran's advocate who had been helping with the case, had located several witnesses who could testify to Marcus's character. and the authenticity of certain aspects of his military experience. These witnesses included former colleagues, community members, and even some military personnel who remembered Marcus from his service. The challenge, Bradley explained, is that most of the people who could most definitively vouch for Marcus's service are either dead, unavailable, or constrained by the same classification restrictions that created this problem in the first place. Martinez had also arranged for expert testimony about the psychological authenticity of Marcus's PTSD symptoms and about the general challenges faced by veterans whose service records were incomplete or classified. While this testimony wouldn't prove that Marcus was a SEAL, it might help explain why his case was more complex than the prosecution suggested. As they prepared for the defense phase of the trial, Marcus received an unexpected phone call. The voice on the other end was familiar but unexpected. Commander Harrison, his former commanding officer, calling with urgent news. "Marcus, I just received word from Admiral Morrison. There have been some developments that might affect your case. I can't discuss the details over the phone, but you need to know that people at very high levels are paying attention to your situation." Harrison explained that Admiral Morrison had been working through official channels to find a way to provide some form of verification for Marcus's service without compromising ongoing classified programs. The process was complex and bureaucratic, but there was a possibility that some limited information might be made available. "The challenge," Harrison continued, "is that even if the Admiral can provide some verification, it may not come in time to affect your trial. The government's classification review process moves slowly, and your trial is already underway." Marcus felt a familiar mixture of hope and frustration. Even in this moment of crisis, the same bureaucratic obstacles that had created his problems continued to prevent their resolution. He wondered if the system was simply too complex and compartmentalized to allow for justice in his case. As the defense prepared to begin their presentation, Marcus reflected on the irony of his situation. He had spent years protecting government secrets, following protocols that required him to deny his own involvement in successful operations. Now, those same protocols were preventing him from defending himself against false accusations. The defense phase would begin with character witnesses, who would testify to Marcus's integrity and humble demeanor. Jim Rodriguez, his manager at the hardware store, would describe Marcus as a quiet, hard-working employee who never boasted about his military service. Sarah would testify about her husband's character and about the authentic trauma symptoms she had observed throughout their marriage. Her testimony would be particularly important because it came from someone who knew Marcus intimately and who had no reason to support false claims. Several members of their community would testify about Marcus's reputation for honesty and his contributions to local veteran organizations. These witnesses would help establish that Marcus was not someone who sought attention or recognition through false claims. The defense would also present expert testimony about PTSD and about the challenges faced by veterans with incomplete service records. Dr. Michael Stevens, a psychiatrist who specialized in treating special operations veterans, would testify that Marcus's psychological symptoms were consistent with authentic combat trauma. As the first day of the defense case approached, Marcus tried to prepare himself for the possibility that even their best efforts might not be enough to overcome the prosecution's systematic presentation of his lack of documentation. The gap between classified truth and public evidence remained as wide as ever. However, there were also reasons for cautious optimism. Admiral Morrison's involvement suggested that powerful people understood the truth of Marcus's situation, even if they couldn't immediately act on that understanding. The defense witnesses would present a different narrative about Marcus's character and the complexity of his situation. Most importantly, Marcus knew that he was fighting not just for his own freedom, but for recognition of the service and sacrifice of all the men who had served alongside him in operations that would never be publicly acknowledged. Their memory and their honor were worth fighting for, regardless of the personal cost. As he prepared for another day in court, Marcus looked at his tattoo one more time, remembering the day he had received it, and the brothers who had shared that tradition with him. Whatever happened in the trial, he knew that his service had been real and meaningful, even if the legal system couldn't recognize it. The battle for his freedom was entering its most critical phase, and Marcus was determined to fight it with the same dedication and courage he had shown during his military service. The outcome remained uncertain, but his commitment to the truth was unwavering. Tomorrow would bring new testimony, new evidence, and perhaps new hope for vindication. Marcus closed his eyes and tried to prepare himself for whatever lay ahead, drawing strength from the knowledge that he had served his country with honor, regardless of what official records might suggest. The courthouse atmosphere was different as the defense began presenting their case. Word had leaked that high-ranking military officials were taking interest in the proceedings, and the gallery now included several individuals in military dress uniforms whose presence suggested that this case had implications beyond a simple fraud prosecution. Marcus noticed the change immediately as he entered the courtroom, feeling both encouragement and additional pressure from the increased scrutiny. Attorney Martinez called her first witness, Jim Rodriguez, who took the stand with obvious nervousness but clear determination to support his employee. Rodriguez had worked with Marcus for 3 years and had observed his behavior and character on a daily basis. Mr. Rodriguez, Martinez began, can you describe Marcus Thompson's demeanor and behavior during his employment at your hardware store? Marcus is the most professional, reliable employee I've ever had, Rodriguez testified. He's quiet, hardworking, and always willing to help customers solve their problems. In 3 years, I've never heard him brag about anything, especially his military service. Rodriguez described how Marcus would often help veteran customers with their projects, offering technical expertise and sometimes refusing payment for his assistance. He noted that Marcus seemed uncomfortable when customers thanked him for his service and typically changed the subject when military topics arose. Has Mr. Thompson ever claimed to be a Navy SEAL in your presence? Martinez asked. Never. In fact, I didn't even know he had been in the military until I saw it on his job application. He's never talked about what he did in the Navy, and he certainly never claimed to be any kind of special forces or anything like that. Under cross-examination, Prosecutor Chen attempted to suggest that Marcus's reluctance to discuss his service was evidence of deception rather than humility. Rodriguez firmly disagreed, explaining that many veterans in their community were similarly private about their military experiences. Sarah Thompson took the stand next, her composure carefully maintained despite the obvious strain of the past months. Her testimony would be crucial in establishing Marcus's character and the authenticity of his psychological struggles. Mrs. Thompson, Martinez asked gently, can you describe your husband's behavior and any symptoms you've observed that might be related to his military service? Sarah took a deep breath before responding. Marcus has had nightmares for as long as I've known him. Not every night, but regularly. He'll wake up in a cold sweat, sometimes calling out names I don't recognize. When I ask him about it, he just says they're work dreams and changes the subject. She described how Marcus would sometimes become hypervigilant in crowded places, positioning himself where he could see all exits and becoming uncomfortable when strangers approached from behind. These behaviors were consistent with combat-related PTSD, but had never been connected to any specific military experiences that Marcus was willing to discuss. Mrs. Thompson, has your husband ever boasted about his military service or sought recognition for his experiences? Just the opposite, Sarah replied. I've always wished he would talk more about his time in the Navy because I could see that keeping everything bottled up was hurting him. When he finally agreed to see someone at the VA, I was hopeful that it would help him process whatever he went through. Prosecutor Chen's cross-examination was respectful but pointed, focusing on the inconsistencies between Marcus's claimed service and the official records. Sarah acknowledged that she had been shocked by the charges against her husband, but maintained her belief in his honesty. Mrs. Thompson, given what you've learned about the discrepancies in your husband's service record, do you have any doubts about his truthfulness? Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her eyes finding Marcus's across the courtroom. I've been married to Marcus for 15 years. I know who he is as a person. If he says he served with SEAL teams, then I believe him, regardless of what government databases might show. Dr. Michael Stevens, the psychiatrist specializing in special operations veterans, provided expert testimony about the authenticity of Marcus's PTSD symptoms. Stevens had extensive experience working with SEAL teams and other special operations units, giving his testimony particular credibility. Dr. Stevens, Martinez asked, have you had the opportunity to evaluate Mr. Thompson's psychological presentation? Yes, I have. Based on my examination and review of his VA records, Mr. Thompson presents with symptoms entirely consistent with combat-related PTSD. specifically the type we see in special operations personnel who have been involved in high-stress, dangerous operations. Stevens explained that the specific combination of symptoms Marcus displayed, the hypervigilance, sleep disturbances, emotional numbing, and difficulty discussing traumatic experiences, formed a pattern typical of special operations veterans rather than conventional military personnel. In your professional opinion, Dr. Stevens, would it be possible for someone to fake this particular constellation of symptoms? It would be extremely difficult, if not impossible. The symptoms Mr. Thompson displays have developed over years and are deeply integrated into his behavioral patterns. This is not something someone could fake convincingly, especially not to multiple trained mental health professionals. During cross-examination, Prosecutor Chen challenged Stevens's conclusions, suggesting that PTSD symptoms could develop from various traumatic experiences, not necessarily combat. Stevens agreed but maintained that the specific pattern of Marcus's symptoms was most consistent with special operations combat exposure. Tom Bradley, the veterans advocate, testified about the systemic problems faced by veterans whose service records were incomplete or classified. His testimony helped explain why Marcus's situation, while unusual, was not impossible within the complex military bureaucracy. Mr. Bradley, Martinez asked, in your experience working with veterans, have you encountered other cases where legitimate military service was difficult to verify? Unfortunately, yes. The military's classification system sometimes creates situations where veterans cannot prove their service through normal channels. This is particularly true for personnel who worked in highly classified programs or special operations units that operated under deep cover. Bradley described several cases he had encountered where legitimate veterans had faced similar challenges, though none as severe as Marcus's current legal troubles. He explained how the compartmentalized nature of classified programs could result in service records that appeared incomplete or inconsistent to outside investigators. Several character witnesses from Marcus's community testified about his reputation for honesty and his contributions to local veteran organizations. These witnesses painted a picture of a humble, dedicated individual who sought to help other veterans while avoiding personal recognition. As the defense presentation continued, there was an unusual stirring in the courtroom. Marcus noticed that Judge Hawkins was conferring quietly with her clerk and appeared to be receiving some kind of urgent communication. The judge called for a brief recess, during which she disappeared into her chambers for nearly an hour. When court reconvened, Judge Hawkins looked troubled but determined. Counsel for both sides, please approach the bench for a sidebar conference. The hushed conversation at the judge's bench lasted several minutes, with both attorneys occasionally glancing back at Marcus with expressions of surprise and confusion. When they returned to their positions, Martinez looked cautiously hopeful, while Prosecutor Chen appeared frustrated and concerned. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Judge Hawkins announced, due to some developments that have just come to my attention, we will be recessing for the remainder of the day. Court will reconvene tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. As the courtroom cleared, Marcus tried to catch his attorney's eye, hoping for some explanation of what had just occurred. Martinez approached him with an expression of barely contained excitement. Marcus, I can't give you details right now, but Admiral Morrison has apparently been working through official channels, and something significant has happened. We need to meet immediately to discuss how this might affect your case. That evening, in the conference room at Martinez's law firm, the defense team gathered to process the day's unexpected developments. Tom Bradley was present, along with Commander Harrison, who had driven down from Washington specifically for this meeting. Gentlemen, Commander Harrison began, Admiral Morrison has been working tirelessly to find a way to verify Marcus's service without compromising ongoing classified programs. Today, he received authorization to provide limited information to the court through proper legal channels. Harrison explained that the authorization had come from the highest levels of the Pentagon, following weeks of careful review and bureaucratic maneuvering. While the information that could be disclosed remained limited, it might be sufficient to establish that Marcus had indeed served in capacities not reflected in standard personnel databases. The challenge, Harrison continued, is that this information cannot be presented in open court due to classification restrictions. However, Judge Hawkins has been briefed through secure channels, and she now understands that there are legitimate classification issues affecting Marcus's case. Attorney Martinez was taking detailed notes, trying to understand the legal implications of these developments. Commander, does this mean that the charges against Marcus will be dropped? Not automatically, Harrison replied. The government still has the option to proceed with prosecution, but they now have information that complicates their case significantly. The decision about how to proceed will ultimately be made at levels well above the local prosecutor's office. Marcus felt a familiar mixture of hope and caution. After months of disappointment, he was afraid to believe that vindication might finally be within reach. What happens next? He asked. Tomorrow, there will likely be closed hearings where classification issues can be discussed without compromising national security, Harrison explained. Admiral Morrison will be available to provide testimony, though the exact format and scope of his involvement remain to be determined. As the meeting concluded, Marcus drove home through the dark streets of his hometown, his mind racing with possibilities. For the first time since his arrest, he felt that the truth about his service might actually emerge through official channels rather than remaining hidden in classified databases. Sarah was waiting for him when he arrived home, her face reflecting the same cautious hope that Marcus felt. Jim Rodriguez called, she said. He heard something happened in court today but didn't have details. What's going on? Marcus sat beside his wife on their living room couch, the same couch where they had planned their daughter's education and their retirement before his world had been turned upside down by fraud charges. I think Admiral Morrison may have found a way to verify my service record, Marcus said carefully. I can't give you details yet, but there's a possibility that this whole nightmare might finally be over. Sarah took his hand, her eyes filling with tears she had been holding back for months. Marcus, I need you to know something. Even when I was scared and confused about what was happening, I never really doubted you. I know who you are, and I know you would never lie about something so important. The next morning brought an unprecedented scene to the federal courthouse. Military vehicles were parked outside, and personnel with high-level security clearances were seen entering through secured entrances. The media presence had intensified, with reporters speculating about the unusual military involvement in what had begun as a simple fraud case. Marcus arrived at court to find that the proceedings would be conducted differently than normal. Judge Hawkins announced that portions of the day's hearings would be conducted in closed session, with only essential personnel present due to classification requirements. Due to national security considerations that have been brought to my attention, Judge Hawkins explained to the jury, certain aspects of this case must be addressed through classified procedures. You will be excused while these matters are resolved. As the jury filed out, Marcus noticed a familiar figure entering the courtroom. Admiral Morrison walked with the bearing of someone accustomed to command, his dress uniform impeccable, and his bearing projecting quiet authority. Behind him walked Captain Williams and another officer Marcus didn't recognize. The closed hearing lasted for 3 hours, during which Marcus and his attorney were excluded, along with the prosecution team. Only Judge Hawkins, Admiral Morrison, and security-cleared court personnel were present for the classified briefing that would potentially determine Marcus's fate. When court reconvened in open session, Judge Hawkins appeared thoughtful and somewhat relieved. She had clearly received information that significantly changed her understanding of the case. Counsel for both sides, Judge Hawkins began, I have received classified briefings that bear directly on the charges against the defendant. While I cannot discuss the specific content of these briefings in open court, they have provided important context for the allegations in this case. Prosecutor Chen rose, clearly struggling with developments beyond her control. Your Honor, the government requests a recess to consult with superiors regarding how to proceed in light of the new information. Request granted, Judge Hawkins replied. Court will recess for 24 hours to allow both sides to consider their positions. As the courtroom cleared, Marcus caught Admiral Morrison's eye. The Admiral approached him with an expression of quiet satisfaction, as if a long-standing problem had finally been resolved. Thompson, Admiral Morrison said quietly, your service to this country has been exemplary, and your continued discretion in protecting classified information has been admirable. I want you to know that the truth about your service has now been officially acknowledged through appropriate channels. Marcus felt a weight lifting from his shoulders that had been there since the day of his arrest. Admiral, I can't thank you enough for what you've done. Morrison shook his hand with the firm grip of someone who understood the bonds forged in military service. Thompson, you served your country with honor, and your country owes you better than what you've endured these past months. That evening, Marcus received a call from Commander Harrison with news that would change everything. The Pentagon had authorized the declassification of sufficient information to verify Marcus's service without compromising ongoing operations. More importantly, the Justice Department had been instructed to review all charges against Marcus in light of the newly available information. Marcus, Harrison said, his voice carrying relief and satisfaction, I think your nightmare is about to end. The truth about your service is finally going to be officially acknowledged. As Marcus shared the news with Sarah, he thought about all the men who had served alongside him in operations that would never be publicly known. Their sacrifice and dedication had finally been validated, not just through his vindication, but through the system's recognition that some service required different forms of verification. The next morning would bring the resolution Marcus had been hoping for since the day of his arrest. His tattoo, the permanent reminder of his service that no government database could document, had finally been seen and understood by someone with the authority to acknowledge its significance. For the first time in months, Marcus went to sleep without the anxiety that had plagued him throughout the legal proceedings. Tomorrow would bring vindication, but tonight brought something even more precious: the knowledge that the truth about his service had finally emerged from the shadows where it had been hidden for too long. The battle for his freedom and reputation was nearly over, but the victory belonged not just to Marcus, but to all the veterans whose service remained classified and unacknowledged. Their sacrifice had meaning, even when it could not be publicly celebrated, and Marcus's case had proven that the system could recognize and honor that truth when properly motivated to do so. The courthouse was unusually quiet as Marcus arrived for what everyone expected to be the final day of his trial. The media circus that had surrounded the case for weeks had mysteriously diminished overnight, as if someone in authority had requested a more subdued atmosphere for the proceedings. Marcus walked up the courthouse steps with a confidence he hadn't felt since his arrest, knowing that the truth about his service was finally going to emerge from decades of official secrecy. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was electric with anticipation. Sarah sat in her usual place in the front row, but her expression had changed from anxious worry to cautious hope. Ashley was beside her, having insisted on being present for what might be her father's vindication. The gallery was filled with many of the same faces that had followed the case from the beginning, but there was a new sense of expectation in the air. Judge Hawkins entered the courtroom with an unusual document in her hand, a sealed envelope bearing official Pentagon markings. As she took her seat at the bench, she looked directly at Marcus with an expression that seemed to convey both relief and satisfaction. Ladies and gentlemen, Judge Hawkins began, before we proceed with today's proceedings, I have received additional information through official government channels that directly affects this case. I am going to ask the jury to be seated so that certain matters can be addressed in open court. As the jury filed into their seats, Marcus noticed that Admiral Morrison was once again present in the courtroom, this time accompanied by a larger contingent of military personnel. Their presence suggested that whatever was about to happen had been coordinated at the highest levels of government. Prosecutor Janet Chen rose from her seat, but her usual confidence had been replaced by visible uncertainty. Your Honor, the government has received instructions from the Department of Justice regarding how to proceed with this case. We have been authorized to make a statement that may affect the charges against the defendant. Judge Hawkins nodded and gestured for Chen to continue. The prosecutor approached the podium, carrying documents that had obviously been prepared by officials far above her pay grade. Your Honor, Chen began, reading from her prepared statement, the United States government has conducted a comprehensive review of the defendant's military service record, including classified documentation that was not available during the initial investigation. The words hung in the air as Marcus felt his heart racing with anticipation. After months of fighting to prove what he